thanks a lot for for the invitation. I'm honored to be here with you all. Um, so I think the topic of your seminar more broadly, I mean, irrespective of my specific presentation, I think is a very interesting one. A big part of our problems have to do with the way we share burdens in society and globally. So, I mean, addressing the issue from the standpoint of justice, taxes, and global financial integrity, I think is a very appropriate approach, and especially so for climate change, which is, it was Nicholas Stern in 2006 who described climate change as a huge market failure. Um, and I think that's a good way to put it, or a tragedy of the commons. Uh, we all know the problem is serious, or there are a few people who insist on denying it, but less and less so. But it's a problem which is very difficult to address. And the solution, whenever we find it, has to do with the way we allocate resources in society, and in a world made up of states, taxes, and the whole power of the state to manage social wealth is the main way forward to address this issue. And moving up to the global level as is necessary, because climate change is a global problem. It's again an allocation problem, but at the global level, not only within states, but among states. So that is very much the case. So let's move forward with the presentation. Since I'm talking to, where I'm speaking in an American university, although I know your audience is very international, or I suppose so, as many American universities, but it's interesting to remind a very important American woman, Eunice Newton Foote. She was a scientist and an inventor, and she was the first person to realize that the greenhouse properties of carbon dioxide. So she wrote this paper. It's probably known to most of you. There was recently a theater play about her life. But in 1856, she presented a paper for the first time, formulating and presenting to the world this recognition that carbon dioxide has this property of trapping heat, meaning visible electromagnetic waves coming from the sun. They can go through carbon dioxide without difficulty, but when they hit the surface and lower temperature radiation in the form of infrared radiation, it has a great difficulty to go through, to pass through carbon dioxide. So that's it. It's like a valve or a greenhouse. In fact, greenhouses made of glass are a much older tradition. It dates back to Renaissance. And in the 19th century, there was this explosion of greenhouses, greenhouse construction, kew gardens, and so on, as glass became cheaper and so on. So people started building glass greenhouses everywhere. And well, carbon dioxide makes a similar thing. And she was the first person to identify this. And funnily enough, she couldn't even present her paper because it was deemed inappropriate for a woman to present, I mean, to make an oral presentation. So it was her husband who delivered the presentation of her original paper. 40 years later, the Swedish Nobel laureate Svante Arrhenius developed it further, and for the first time raised the issue that this could happen at a global level, that carbon dioxide concentrations at the global level could be such as to change the global climate as a whole. And but for a long time, this was still very much at the speculation level, although it was already a relevant scientific question. But speaking of Sweden, still in 1972, when we had the Stockholm conference on United Nations conference on the human environment, that was the name of the first such summit. Climate change was a minor issue. The discussion there was much more about chemical pollution, use of resources. There was a strong Malthusian view about population growth, especially in the third world. So there was a lot of pressure in this sense, but climate change was a minor concern. It figures already in the 1972 Stockholm Declaration and work plan, but as a secondary issue, it was in the 80s that the issue really started to gather attention from the scientific community and increasingly from scientists. The problem was already brewing, but it was not perceptible yet. And for us to have a notion of how justice is an issue here, let's see this first slide. So this is from Carbon Map, which is a very interesting source of such types of studies. This is the world deformed according to historical responsibility, meaning contributions to the greenhouse gas phenomenon. And this picture is still less distorted than it should be for two reasons. First, because it only takes note of the linear effects of greenhouse gas, but there are also non-linear effects in the sense that carbon dioxide that was emitted a long time ago, it works exponentially. So the first increases in in carbon dioxide concentrations have a much greater effect than subsequent ones. And also because this doesn't measure per capita contributions. This is at the nation state level, and it doesn't take into account per capita emissions or per capita historical emissions. So the distortion could still be greater. I mean, as I said, the fact that carbon dioxide can cause the greenhouse effect and climate change. First, the greenhouse effect. It's known since 1856, as I've just shown. And then since 1896, there was this first conjecture that it could happen at a global level. But of course, it doesn't mean that when people were burning coal, we just celebrated 200 years of the first passenger train, which was in 1825 in England. Of course, when people were burning coal back then, they weren't like just cynically saying, well, 200 years from now, people will be in trouble for climate change, but I don't care. Of course, that's not the case. This wasn't done consciously, but it did happen. And the coincidence between historical responsibilities and per capita income is very close. Um, so although these people who did it, or the countries who industrialized first, they didn't do it on purpose, but the fact is that capital has been accumulated, both material and human capital, and it has been disproportionately so in those countries who industrialized earlier. So there is a very clear burden sharing issue that needs to be addressed. And since justice is the first word of this seminar, this is an issue that has to be borne in mind. And to make the point stronger, let's go to the second map. So now this is vulnerability. I mean, there's a huge mismatch between the states or the societies who contributed most to the causes of climate change and those who suffer most. So I think if we pick two low-lying countries, the Netherlands and Bangladesh, I think the situation is very eloquent. Well, Bangladesh, actually, which is not a very large country, is quite visible here beside India, as you can see. It's an extremely vulnerable country because it's one of the poorest countries in the world. And topographically, as you know, it's a low-lying country, just like the Netherlands. But the Netherlands is very tiny here because it's on the other extreme in the income ladder. It's a very rich country, so they have the means to protect themselves by whichever means necessary. Whereas Bangladesh, as I said, is in the other extreme. They are they're just struggling to make ends meet. So this, I think, makes the point very eloquently as to the dimension of the distributive problems that climate change raises. So now let's move to more concrete issues, taxes, and so on. So the next slide gives us an idea of um, the extent to which the problem is aggravated by an improper allocation of resources. So nowadays, now I'm moving to ecosystems. Climate change, roughly uh, 3/4 of the climate change problem has to do with fossil fuels, and 1/4 with land use and land use change. But I am focusing here on this smaller quarter, meaning forests and other ecosystems who are at the same time carbon stocks and carbon sinks. That is, they help suck the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, both terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems. Roughly half of the natural carbon sequestration takes place in the oceans and the other half in the continents. It's an approximation. That's not the exact number as usual in any natural phenomenon, but it's a rough approximation. So, and we are here talking about terrestrial ecosystems, and I will focus especially on tropical rainforests. We will get there. But so this is from that UNEP report that I sent as part of the bibliography of the course. So here we have this picture of nature negative funding. Roughly per year, almost $7 trillion are spent in nature negative activities. The UNEP defines nature negative in a very broad sense as anything that harms ecosystems. Um, the details can be discussed here or there, but the general picture is this: roughly almost $7 trillion spent on nature negative activities and 200 billion on nature positive activities. So again, it's a shocking problem of misallocation of resources. It's not easy to solve. If it were, we would have already solved it. These things create dependencies. We're just seeing here in Latin America a few days ago, there were very significant demonstrations against the government who was cutting subsidies on fossil fuels, I think specifically diesel oil. So once these subsidies are in place, it's very hard to remove them. So the issue is very complicated. But the bulk of these subsidies are not in Ecuador, they are in rich countries. So I think the problem is even more serious. And to some extent, subsidies may always be necessary, for instance, on clean cooking. If the alternative is between women and children getting sick inhaling smoke from wood stoves or burning fossil methane, I think the choice is clearly for fossil methane. But it's not always the case. There are subsidies for luxury consumption. Usually, kerosene for air transportation is tax free. That's what makes it that very often traveling by plane, especially in Europe, traveling by plane is often cheaper than traveling by train. This has a lot to do with the tax exemption for kerosene. So this creates huge distortions. And as you certainly know, we can see subsidies not only as money directly given by the government, but disproportionate tax exemptions. If you tax trains and you don't tax kerosene for aircraft, it is another form of subsidy. So this creates all these distortions. And so this all goes back to the issue of how resources are inappropriately allocated and create these problems. So now let's move on. Let's focus on this $200 billion who are. Here we see there's a breakdown of the to the extreme right. We have the breakdown of where these environmentally harmful subsidies are allocated. uh, 5.7 trillion are investments, right? And no, 5 trillion are investments and 1.7 trillion is subsidies. And as we see in 2022, the bulk of that went to fossil fuels, 1.16 trillion dollars in subsidies for fossil fuels. And then second comes agriculture, which is also sizable, $350 billion subsidies for nature negative activities in agriculture. We all eat, we all need food, so nobody's advocating the end of agriculture here. But very often things are done in an unsustainable manner, including in my country. I'm not trying to simplify the issue here, but elsewhere in the world as well. We know agricultural subsidies are a very complicated and well-known problem, and it creates a lot of distortions. Also, for fisheries, subsidies for fisheries are decreasing, but they used to be huge, and this causes a lot of harm. So next, let's go then to nature positive funding. um, I was trying to see if I could get the slides right, but I can't. So let's get about it. Okay, so on the nature positive side, to your on the top right corner, you have this diagram which shows the coincidence. This whole report is based on the so-called Rio Conventions, meaning the climate change regime, that is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, and Paris Agreement. So generally the UNFCCC acronym for the climate change regime, UNCCD for the desertification regime, and CBD for the Convention on Biodiversity. These are known as the three Rio Conventions. The first two, UNFCCC and CBD, were open for signature during the Rio Conference in 1992. That is 20 years after Stockholm, right? That was the second Earth Summit, so to speak. And the Desertification Convention was not adopted in Rio, but that's where the mandate for negotiations was launched, and it was adopted 2 years later. But it's known also as the Rio Convention for that reason. So as you see, there are areas where these sets of actions meet. So nature positive actions have everything to do with addressing in a coordinated manner the issues raised by these three regimes. And speaking of Belém, the COP, it will be a COP of the Climate Convention and Paris Agreement and so on. But one of the main issues that we are working on and is what we call synergy among the Rio Conventions. I mean, how we can address uh, climate change while also doing positive actions for biodiversity and for fighting desertification and land degradation more broadly. So this is an important challenge, and there's an old, I mean, this has been discussed for a long time, but recently it has come high on the agenda again, this issue of the synergy between these three regimes. And so the report, the UNEP report that we are discussing here, it focuses all the time on the so-called real targets, which are then the goals that were set by these three regimes jointly. And as we were saying, there is nowadays, or these data are from 2022, which is the latest that we have. So they sort of break down, there is roughly $200 billion of investment in these nature positive actions per year. And this is how they break down. One graph, which, but I will talk to it in the next slide. Yeah, let's move to the next one. I think we have more interesting things to see there. Yeah, so this to the left graph, we see a breakdown into these different nature positive actions. So the bulk of what has to be done is on nature, on forest, on ecosystem conservation, but especially tropical forests. And this is so for a few reasons. The main one is that nowadays there has been a lot of deforestation in temperate and cold forests, especially in the 19th and the 20th and the 20th century. So most forested areas in temperate countries in the US, in Canada, or in Europe, most of the forests we see today, they are replanted forests. They're not old growth forests. Most of them were cut. I remember a few years ago, I made a trip in Sweden in summer. It was spectacular to see all that forest, but that's all planted forest, like about 100-year-old forest by now. But in the early 20th century, this forest had all been cut. It was just replanted. Same holds for Japan. Japan now has a much more than half of its territory covered by forests, but also these are all planted forests. They're not old growth, pristine forests. But that said, nowadays in temperate countries, forest cover has been growing already for some time. So where there is significant deforestation nowadays is in the tropics. In Brazil, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Indonesia, and elsewhere. And these countries also happen to be among the poorest countries in the world. And I don't like to make euphemisms about Brazil. We are an income upper middle income country in the UN classification. But I frankly often refer to Brazil as a poor country. 40% of our population doesn't even have sewage collection. So, I mean, we may be better off than many poorer countries elsewhere in the world, and we are a G20 country. But this has more to do with scale than really with our income level, especially because we also have the title, of which I'm not proud, that we are one of the most unequal countries in the world. So income is very concentrated in Brazil. So we have some billionaires, but much of our population lives in a very different condition, very difficult conditions. So I was saying, so deforestation is happening in the tropics, mostly poor countries, poor societies, which just makes it more complicated to address the problem. But so as we see this graph here on the top left, you see that the bulk of the issue to be addressed is about conservation, protection. That's the dark blue color here. So the main challenge is to stop deforestation. More so, everything else has to be done as well. We have to do sustainable land management, as you see. There's a great job of restoration to be done. In Brazil's nationally determined contribution, NDC, which is the country's main commitment to the Paris Agreement, we have committed to replanting 12 million hectares by 2030. This is 120,000 square kilometers, is more than the territory of Portugal. And we're not just talking about planting eucalyptus, we're talking about reconstituting biodiverse tropical forests, which is much more complicated. Roughly, to plant a biodiverse tropical forest, it costs roughly 8 times more than to plant an eucalyptus forest. So this is a very daunting challenge, but we're taking it very seriously, especially in those areas in the south of the Amazon that were illegally deforested. So this is where the bulk of our actions are concentrated. So there's a lot of work to be done on forest restoration as well, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the main challenge is to conserve what we have. Because if you cut the forest, it takes about 50 years to sequester the same carbon that you released immediately by cutting that forest. So the cleverest solution, if only for for climate change is to just preserve the forest rather than replant it. And there are all the other reasons as well, soil protection, biodiversity conservation, and so on. No matter how carefully you try to reconstitute a biodiverse forest, it will never be the same as an old growth pristine forest. So conservation is the main challenge. And bear this in mind when we talk about TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, which is our main proposal for forest conservation. We will get there eventually. So now the graph to the right, how much NBS stands for nature-based solutions. So how much money we need to further invest in nature-based solutions. As you can see there from 2025 onwards, the green bar is public finance and the brown bar is private finance. I mean, the more we can get private finance, the better. But it should be clear and we should be frank about that. Very often, it doesn't pay to conserve forests or to restore forests. We do our best to find market-friendly solutions, carbon market, and so on. But very often, it just doesn't pay. Unless we can allocate public resources to do it, it won't happen. There are some, we talk about bioeconomy, there are things you can do with the standing forest. There's extractivism, Brazil nuts, you may find them in the market in the US, palm heart, and a few other things, but it pays much more to cut the forest and raise cattle or plant soybeans than to conserve it. So we should be frank about this inconvenient truth and be serious about how to solve the problem. I'm not advocating cutting forests, on the contrary, but precisely to address the problem, we need to recognize its full extent, especially, as I was saying, in a poor society, as is the case in Brazil, and more so in most other tropical countries. So now this is an analysis of these three main challenges: conservation, restoration, and deforestation reduction. This is a partnership we've been doing with the Climate Policy Initiative, which is a very interesting think tank, which has been working together with us in an initiative, which I'll show in the next slide. So it's just a study of how, to the right, you have different types of existing initiatives. For instance, on the top, you have the Amazon Fund, which is a Red Plus fund established in Brazil 15 years ago, which has received resources from several donors, especially governments, also companies, but especially governments. The largest donor by far is Norway. Germany is also a significant donor. The US, during the Biden administration, has made a donation of $50 million as well. As an order of magnitude, Norway donated more than $1 billion. The US has donated 50 million, and a few other. The UK has made a significant donation as well. This is based on the REDD Plus mechanism. So the fund issues certificates proportional to the grants, which are calculated on the basis of the deforestation that was avoided previously. So it's a results-based payment in the REDD Plus mechanism. There's more information about this in the UN website, and the Amazon Fund has its own website as well. But that's just one example among many that you see there in the. So the idea here is to show that these are the three main actions that need to be addressed: conservation, restoration, and deforestation reduction. And in order to coordinate and to try to have a coherent action among tropical forest developing countries, Brazil is one of the creators of a group of 20 countries called United for Our Forests. This group was launched there was the Amazon Summit. That's from the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization. This summit was held in Belém, the same city where we will have the climate COP. It took place um, in August 2023. And back then we launched this group and it has since expanded. We are now 20 countries, 20 tropical forest developing countries, covering roughly 60% of all tropical forests in the world, tropical rainforests. So these countries are all the 9 Amazon countries, plus Guatemala, Mexico, Cuba, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Republic of the Congo, Liberia, Ghana, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. So it's a very representative group. And we have been holding meetings on a regular basis since then. This is just an example. This was the invitation for our meeting in Baku at COP29. And the latest meeting we have had was in New York City 2 weeks ago during the New York Climate Week. So it's a very active and interesting group. And we have recently launched a concept paper, which is one of the documents I've sent for the bibliography of this lecture. And in this group, so in this concept paper, we try to study what are the main financial instruments for addressing the challenge of conserving forests and avoiding deforestation and restoring forests. And we agreed that there are roughly 8 main mechanisms. As you can see there: grants, Global Environment Facility and the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and ODA, Official Development Assistance, are examples of that. For credit, we have bonds, loans. And it's interesting to note that very often these mechanisms are used together. So for instance, one of the key tools we have is blended finance. So very often risks are very high in developing countries. So in order to make, sometimes you can make a project viable, economically viable, if only you can address the risk, which increases significantly the cost of money. So if you can address this extra cost of the risk with grants, then you may make the rest of the investment viable on a commercial basis, on the basis of issuing bonds or loans and so on. So this is what we call blended finance. Debt alleviation is a very important tool as well. Just recently in Ecuador, one of the countries which are members of our group, they've had a very important project of debt for nature swap. So it's a very interesting example. Very often these countries, well, the creditors accept to reduce or even write off the whole debt in exchange for commitments to nature protection. Forest-related green equities is also a very important tool. The 2 main projects, private restoration projects in Brazil nowadays, they're planning to restore 3 million hectares of the Amazon forest. And it's essentially an example of green equities. They're raising capital investment, and they'll try to make money with these forests, both with carbon credits for the carbon market, which is the 8th tool shown there, plus timber and so on. So they raise this capital as green equities. Risk sharing is a very important tool as well. Just as I was saying, risks are very high in developing countries. So sometimes, and sometimes unduly high, and that will be my controversy with Max here. I think there is often a way in between. Sometimes the risks are exaggerated. I mean, financially, what is charged as, due to a perceived risk is an is an unreasonable price. So sometimes if you can raise some capital or grant capital or concessional money to address this plus associated with risk, you can make sustainable projects viable. payment for ecosystem services, that's the TFF. I will talk later about it. Yeah, I don't need to develop this now. Results-based payments, that's the case of the RED Plus mechanism. That's, for instance, the funding that we have for the Amazon Fund in Brazil. By the way, the Amazon Fund, the certificates issues in terms of avoided emissions, they are only from the Brazilian forests, but the Amazon Fund also invests overseas. The money received and managed by the Brazilian National Development Bank, up to, I think, 20% of the resources can be invested in other tropical forest developing countries. And it is happening. In fact, there are some projects elsewhere in the Amazon funded by the Amazon Fund. So it's not all the resources that are invested in Brazil. And as I was saying, the carbon market, both regulated and voluntary. The carbon market, it's interesting. People very often say negative things about the Kyoto Protocol. I'm old enough to remember when the Kyoto Protocol was operating, and I have a very positive view of the Kyoto Protocol. And I'm saying this because the Kyoto Protocol essentially created the carbon market. There was no such thing before the Kyoto Protocol. Unfortunately, the Kyoto Protocol didn't prosper. It was sabotaged by several governments, especially the US government, but not only, and it didn't prosper. Now we have the Paris Agreement, which is also a very important and positive treaty. That's the way forward. But I would just like to make this point that the carbon market was created by the Kyoto Protocol. And in some areas, it's quite successful. The EU emissions trading system is a very important carbon market mechanism. It moves hundreds of billions of euros a year. And in fact, it helped a lot to get efficiency gains within the EU. And China now has the largest carbon market in the world in terms of tons. It's bigger than the EU ETS. So it's a very successful tool, but it's not trivial to apply carbon markets to forests. There are some very complicated technical challenges there. It's one thing to avoid burning coal, like replacing it with a cleaner source of energy, say wind power, solar, whatever. Then you're just keeping the fossil fuel below ground. But if you're issuing credits in exchange for forest conservation or for forest restoration, you're building a biological carbon stock which is vulnerable. This forest can be burnt. 100 years from now, people may forget about the project and just cut the forest. So it's not the same thing. There are many complications for including forests or ecosystems more broadly in the carbon market. That's why it has not prospered as much as we would like it to so far. But still, it is a very promising avenue, and it's certainly a part of the solution and a part which can grow significantly more. As you can see in one of the previous slides, there are expectations for the carbon market to play a much more significant role in the future. Well, I forgot where is the reference to the carbon market, but that's not important. But anyway, it is recognized that the carbon market can play a much more significant role than it was placed today. But yeah, since I stopped here, let me remind you of this. So I was saying, yes, we can attract private finance to forests, and we should do that. The state cannot fund everything, but as I was saying, very often it doesn't pay, or it's very often impossible to charge for all the ecosystem services that forests provide. So just to give one example, in Brazil, most of the rain that falls in the south of Brazil, roughly in Brazil, half of our territory is the Amazon rainforest, and the other half is the rest of the country, where the bulk of agricultural production takes place, especially in the savanna ecosystem, which we call Cerrado. Most of agriculture in Brazil is rain-fed, and as you probably know, Brazil is a very competitive agricultural producer. We're now the largest soybean producer in the world, the largest beef producer, the largest coffee producer, and so on. And we are, on aggregate, the third or fourth largest agricultural producer in the world after China and the US. Um, but the bulk of this agriculture is not irrigated; it's just rain fed, and but this rain comes from the Amazon. So if we cut the Amazon, we will have a serious problem with rain elsewhere in the country where the bulk of our agricultural production takes place. So in an ideal world, we could try to perhaps pay for these ecosystem services by charging people who benefits from that rain and investing that money in conservation of the Amazon forest. But mind you, just imagine what it would be to charge those farmers, to tax them 1,000 kilometers south of the Amazon for the rain they get from the Amazon forest. It's not feasible politically. And this rain also falls in Argentina. Argentina is also a very competitive agricultural country, but it's impossible to get them to pay for the ecosystem service provided by the Amazon by the rain that falls in their soybean plantations. And this is true elsewhere in the world. In fact, the Amazon is so big that, and I'm not talking now as a carbon stock, but really as in terms of service, evapotranspiration, and so on, it contributes significantly to reducing the temperature on the surface. It's a conveyor of heat to the upper atmosphere, but we cannot charge for this service. So I'm saying all this to say that it's sometimes very seductive to see these connections and see, well, this we could charge for this and pay for these ecosystem services, and then the market would regulate itself. But that's the point. Climate change is a huge market failure. There's no way to charge for these services and thereby to finance forest conservation based on what other societies or other parts of the country benefit from those environmental services. That's why, as I was saying, a big part or the bulk of costs for nature-based solutions and so on will have to be borne by the state. And so we have to have clarity about these things. So returning to where I was, so these are the main economic tools I was talking about. And this is a picture of tropical forests worldwide. Here, not only equatorial rainforest, but also still tropical, but relatively higher latitudes, like in the south of Brazil. There's another large tropical rainforest in Brazil, which is the Atlantic forest. It was never as big as the Amazon, and unfortunately, more than half of it has been deforested. This is where colonization took place in Brazil when we used to rely during the colony. We were a large sugarcane producer. This was all developed along this Atlantic rainforest. And well, as you can see, there are tropical rainforests in a lot of it also in Africa and also in Asia, including in China, in fact, as you can see there, especially because here we're already talking about subtropical rainforests. So it's a large ecosystem. It's very important also for the carbon cycle, as I was saying, not only as a carbon stock, but also as a carbon sink. It has a significant capacity of carbon sequestration. And especially in as much as we are able to go ahead with significant forest restoration activities, as is our plans in Brazil, as are our plans in Brazil and elsewhere in the world. So it's very important also from that perspective. And that's why we think we need solutions to address this issue. And then we go to the Tropical Forest Forever facility. Thomas suggested that I speak for some time and make an initial pause for questions and answers, and then we move forward. Would you like to make a break here, Thomas, or should I go through all the way to present the TFFF, and then we have a single Q&A session. What would you prefer?
So I think let's break for a moment and see whether we have questions, unclarities, anything, and then move forward, if that's okay with you. Are there any questions here? Anyone?
Yeah, the TFF is the more spicy issue, so perhaps we can. What? If there are questions, they're welcome. Yeah.
Oh, I think
Let's speak into
Oh.
this.
Hello. So thank you for your talk. I had a quick question though, just about you mentioned the importance of climate change, and then a lot of this has been about sort of tropical forest biomes, tropical forests. And I guess I'm wondering just how separable those two issues are, in the sense that is it at least possible to mitigate some of the problems with climate change, independent of how we think about conservation or new forests, and maybe speaking a bit about those strategies as well. Yeah, so I was wondering if you had some thoughts about that.
Yes, and it's a very good question. As I said, 3/4 of the problem have to do with fossil fuels, not with tropical forests. And in fact, if Jesus Christ becomes the president of Brazil and we start to do everything perfectly and stop all deforestation in the Amazon, but we don't address fossil fuels, the Amazon will become a savanna by 2100 just because of climate change. If we don't address fossil fuels, it will not be forests who will save the world. So the bulk of the problem is fossil fuels, not forests. This has to be clear. But 25% of the problem is not negligible. So we also think we should take forests very seriously. And forests are much more than just carbon stocks and carbon sinks. They are values in many other respects. Tropical rainforests are by far the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. I remember reading recently that in one single tree in Peru, in the Amazon, Peruvian Amazon, there are more ant varieties than in the whole of the British Islands. So it is incredibly important as a store of biodiversity. It's a human value more broadly. There are people living there, right? Indigenous peoples in Brazil and elsewhere in the tropical forest, not only in the Americas, also in Africa and in Asia and so on. So forests are a multidimensional issue, and they're important for many reasons other than only climate change. But it's true what you said. As far as climate change is concerned, forests are not the main problem. The main problem is fossil fuels. That's where we should clearly focus our priority investments and concerns. But since Brazil is a peculiar country in two respects, on the one hand, we have a very clean energy mix. Among G20 countries, we have by far the cleanest energy mix. And this is not only out of virtue. We used to believe Brazil had hardly any oil. I was born in 1970, so I still remember with the oil shocks and so on. Our country was desperate. We were very short of hard currency, and we needed to import oil. So we invested very heavily in renewable energies since the 1970s. So more than 80% of electricity in Brazil comes from renewable sources, either hydropower or solar energy or wind power, and also biomass. And we also have a very successful, we're the second largest producer of ethanol, second only to the US, but roughly half of the fuel consumed by cars in Brazil is ethanol. So on the one hand, our energy sector, as I was saying, is quite clean. about half of our energy mix. In electricity is over 80%, as I said, but on aggregate, about half of the energy we consume in Brazil is renewable, hence with a very low carbon footprint. On the other hand, we are the largest tropical forest country in the world, and the second largest the second largest forest country as a whole. Only Russia has more forests than Brazil. And we have a problem of deforestation in Brazil. It is decreasing very significantly, and fortunately so. We had a very serious problem in the previous government. It has improved very significantly, and we continue, and we took a commitment, which is a very bold commitment. It is in our NDC before the Paris Agreement. We want to reach zero deforestation by 2030. This doesn't mean no more tree will ever be cut in Brazil. I think perhaps only North Korea could make such a promise. I mean, we are a liberal democracy under the rule of law. So if a person has a property, if you buy a farm in Brazil, although we have a very stringent environmental legislation, but you're entitled to use your farm and to, generally in Brazil, you can use 80% of your territory and you need to conserve 20% of natural vegetation, which is already enough. Very few, I don't know of any country who has such a legislation. And in the Amazon is the reverse. If you buy 10,000 hectares in the Amazon forest, you can only deforest 2,000 hectares. You have to keep the other 8,000 hectares. So 80% of your land has to be preserved as natural vegetation. So, but even if you meet all these stringent requirements, still, there is land that could still be deforested in Brazil, significantly so. In fact, in the savanna ecosystem, the Cerrado, that's the most productive agricultural land in Brazil nowadays. There is roughly 400,000 square kilometers of area who could still be deforested. This is roughly the territory of Germany. So there is still one Germany to be deforested only in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon savanna. No, not the Amazon, the Brazilian savanna. And this is, as I said, from an agricultural standpoint, this is very highly productive land. So if we're committing to stop all that, we can't do this just by sending the police there. People are entitled to use their land. So the only way to do this is by paying. We have to offer incentives for people to keep their lands. Like, you're entitled to use this land, but I'm paying you not to use it. This is a very ambitious commitment. So to reach zero deforestation, we will have to do that in a large scale, coupled with very ambitious forest restoration as well, as I said. So, yeah. So there's a lot to be done, as I was saying, and we are committed to taking this issue to heart. And in fact, we started this as an unilateral commitment, but nowadays it became a global commitment. In the 19th UN Forum on Forests in 2023, there's a ministerial declaration in which all countries committed to reaching zero net deforestation by 2030. So I was saying Brazil is peculiar in these two senses. In our case, the main source of emissions is land use. That is land use change, deforestation, coupled with agriculture. As I said, we are a very large agricultural country, and agriculture emits significantly also, both methane from ruminants. We are also, as I said, a very large beef producer. So cows and oxen and bulls, they emit methane through their digestion. And also nitrous oxide, which is the third most important greenhouse gas, is emitted through fertilizers. So there is this, and there is deforestation. So the fact is that land use is the largest source of emissions in Brazil, which is very exceptional. The bulk of it, as I said, 3/4 of global emissions come from fossil fuels, not land use. But in Brazil, land use is by far, not by far, but it is the largest source of emissions. It's decreasing precisely because we are fortunately addressing deforestation, but still it remains, we still have emissions from, as I said, methane from cows and nitrous oxide from fertilizers and so on. So, yeah, although fossil fuels is by far the biggest part of the problem, land use is about 1/4 of the problem worldwide. Should I move on to the TFF, Thomas?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, in that picture I showed there of about the main financing tools we have for addressing forest conservation, deforestation, and so on. That's the conclusion of our concept note from the United for Our Forest group, that roughly we have an institutional architecture which covers most of the challenges we have. What is lacking is money. I mean, we have the tools. If only there were enough resources flowing through these 8 mechanisms, we could address deforestation and conservation and so on. What we lack is money. But one exception to that is forest conservation. There aren't many tools for paying for forest conservation. And countries who have large areas of forest, they complain that they are unfairly treated. Examples of this are Guyana, Suriname, Gabon in Africa. These countries have very low deforestation, and they have the bulk of their territories covered with native forests, and they don't get anything for that. They don't get paid for that. It's a very important ecosystem service, but nobody pays for that. So this was a clear gap in the institutional architecture of forest finance. And that's precisely what the Tropical Forest Forever facility is designed to address. It is also true in Brazil. Although I said already, very candidly, we have a problem with deforestation, but the bulk of the Amazon remains pristine. About 80% of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil remains untouched. This is more than the territory of India, for you to have an idea. As you know, Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world after the US. So Brazil is larger than the US without Alaska. It's quite a large country, and about half of it is the Amazon rainforest. And some states in Brazil have, because we are a federal country like the US, and some states in Brazil have the bulk of their territory is still covered by the Amazon rainforest. And these states, they complain, they would like to develop agriculture, and the legislation is very strict on that. So they say, we get nothing for having all that forest. So it's not only an issue of specific land states, but regions within Brazil, for instance, have that same complaint. So this is the kind of thing that the TFF can address. If everything goes right, when it's fully operational, the TFFF will pay $4 per hectare of conserved tropical forest. And we expect it to become the largest, by far the largest source of finance for forests. I see this graph here. I took this from the concept note, the 3rd concept note of the TFFF, which is in your bibliography. You see the graph to the left, but I think it's overly optimistic as regards the assumption for carbon markets. $3.6 billion a year in forest carbon markets. I find this overly optimistic. This estimate was taken from the World Bank. I hope it gets there, but I doubt. But according to the design of the TFFF, it should produce about $4 billion a year to pay for forest conservation. That will be a significant source of money, and it can really make a difference in conserving forests. And it's designed in such a way that, I mean, you only get the money if you really conserve your forests. And the issue is, I mean, 20% of the money will go to to indigenous peoples and local communities, which are some of the most important stewards of forests in the world. In Brazil, for instance, indigenous lands and lands reserved for local communities, which are mostly people who resisted to slavery in Brazil until the 19th century, and they created separate communities for themselves. They are Brazilian citizens like everybody else, but they have a special status and they are entitled to lands as well. So combine these two territories, sets of territories. This is about 13% of the Brazilian territory. Is more than 1 million square kilometers. This is more than twice the size of France, or more than the territory of Mongolia in Asia. So it's quite a lot of land, and the bulk of this is in the Amazon, and these are the best preserved areas in Brazil. And 20% of the resources that Brazil may someday receive from the TFFF will go directly to indigenous peoples and these local communities, the Quilombola and so on. But the other 80% will go to the federal state, which has to make a plan. We'll see later on in the governance of the TFFF. You don't just get this check for nothing. You do whatever you want with it. You have to show very clearly what you will do with the money. So we tend to allocate this very strategically because, as I was saying, in these frontier regions in the savannah, it is very profitable to use those lands for agriculture. If we are to be able to persuade those farmers not to use the lands they're entitled to use, we have to offer them something interesting. And it's not $4 per hectare. That won't do the job. In the most profitable areas there, they can earn up to $1,000 per hectare. And so we will not persuade them with $4 per hectare. But the thing is that the federal government will be able to allocate this money strategically. So we will allocate this money, of course, preferentially to those areas which are more threatened with deforestation, so that we can offer a credible incentive for landowners to conserve their land rather than use it. So this can be really a game-changing tool to address deforestation in the country. And the graph to the right shows the plan, which is that. Well, I'll go to explain the TFF in more detail before I address these issues of how the money will be refunded to investors. So the TFFF, the main novelty that it proposes is that it's not a grants-based fund. So it's not like the Global Environment Facility or the Green Climate Fund, where the money, the bulk of the money comes in the form of grants, and will just be given to countries or to specific projects. The TFFF is an investment fund. So the plan is to gather, it's a bit like an endowment fund, those that American universities use, and for instance, Yale. You receive a significant amount of money and you invest it wisely, and you use only the revenue. This is how the TFF is meant to be. So yeah, the plan is to have a fund of, it will start smaller, but the plan is for it to grow to a fund of $125 billion, which will be invested in profitable projects, and it will pay an interest rate for investors. It is designed to be a very low risk fund and AAA risk fund, and it will raise capital at a riskier capital like BB types of investment, and which pay more, of course. And it has to be done, of course, in a competent way so that there is such a spread. And then we pay the investors, and the difference is what will be directed to pay for ecosystem services. So It will be very tightly controlled. There will be very uh, rigorous governance criteria for country to receive the funds. If deforestation grows in a country, there are penalties and so on. So it's not easy money. Countries have to, the receiving countries have to do their homework in order to receive that money. And let's move forward to further discuss the details of the fund. Um, yeah, let's delve a little bit further here, and I'll tell you more about the financial architecture. So the idea is to raise $25 billion of sovereign capital, which will be relatively more exposed to risk, and to make sure it becomes a AAA fund. And with that, the design is such that we believe roughly there will always be a proportion of 1 to 4. If the fund can raise $25 billion, uh, they're very clever people which know much more than I do about finance, think it is feasible to raise another $100 billion of capital, like from pension funds and other large institutional investors. And you can pay them a decent revenue per year and still have this difference, which was designed to reach. I mean, it's not an act of will. This has been cleverly and carefully designed. It is understood that we can raise that money and still have $4 billion a year to pay about $4 per hectare to cover about 1 billion hectares of tropical rainforest, which is more than twice the Brazilian Amazon. The Brazilian Amazon is 4 million square kilometers or 400 million hectares. And the fund is designed to pay for about 1 billion hectares worldwide. uh, so and so essentially at this point we are talking to key partners who will be the first investors. In fact, Brazil was the first investor. During the New York Climate Week, President Lula announced Brazil as the first investor, and we are investing $1 billion in this fund. And now we're talking to some other key partners to be the other investors. And the design of the fund is such that for the first 10 years, it will only pay interests to the investors, and then between the 10th, the 11th, and the 40th year of functioning of the fund, those initial investors who are more exposed to risk, I mean the governments typically, they will receive their money back with interest. So that's why I was saying it's different from the funds we have so far, which are grant based. We recognize that the context nowadays is very unfavorable. I can't think of a worse time to talk about climate finance. I mean, it has never been so urgent and never has been so difficult to raise funds. So if we were to rely on grants, this would be out of question. I don't need to tell you the context in which we are living. The US is out of the Paris Agreement. Frankly, the US has never really been a spectacular donor, not even through the GCF or the GEF, even during democratic administrations, and now it's out of question. But so the main funders have always been the Europeans, Germany, Norway, and so on, the UK, France. But now with the war in Ukraine, well, this source has just dried out. Countries are worried about defense, and as you know, NATO has NATO countries have taken on very ambitious commitments to invest in defense and so on. So there are no funds available for long-term investments in climate change and so on. The exception to that can be, as I said, if we can have a profitable investment fund with low risk and so on, which is what the TFFF is designed to be. It is designed to be a fund, as I said, AAA, but which will invest essentially in BB markets. And so this is the design plan. It is meant to be announced in Belém. Well, late this month in October, there will be the meeting of the board of governors of the World Bank, and we have proposed the World Bank that they be the institution which will house or host the fund and operate it. And this decision will be taken in October. We're optimistic about that. And the signs we have is that the bank will accept this invitation. They are already the operators of the Global Environment Facility, for instance. So they have a tradition in that. And we hope this will go well. In case they refuse, we will look for another multilateral bank anyway to operationalize the fund. And we plan to announce it, as I said, in Belém during the league.
The connection. Ah, he's back.
Yeah. So I was saying that I'm going to take issue with Max and his criticisms, which as I told him, I really like controversies, and he may be right, but I think he is wrong, and I'll say why. So the design of the fund, and it will stand or fall if what we're saying is true, is that we can raise capital at a low risk, that is a AAA fund, and then invest this money in BB projects, and which pay more, and then pay the revenue for the investors and still have a spread, which is the source of income for the fund. So why is it that we believe this is feasible? Well, that's what the market does all the time, right? I mean, if you have good information, you can know where things are overpriced, where the risk is overestimated, that so that you can invest with relative safety and make money with that. And otherwise, people wouldn't make money in the financial market. Of course, the challenge is who knows where to invest wisely. I'll give two examples. I've just checked just before this class. Banks in Brazil, they're significantly more profitable than banks in the US. Of course, the US is a much richer economy than Brazil, and the per capita income is much higher and everything else. So it's not a miracle. The thing is that, I'm saying that banks are more profitable here. The risk is higher, obviously, but they have been significantly, like several percentage points, more profitable in terms of returns on equity. For the last 20 years, they have been sometimes up to 5% more profitable than US banks. And this is because the Brazilian banks, they know the market, so they know how to evaluate the risk. They can get the reward for this higher risk and still make money. And as I said, make much more money than US banks. So they know how to navigate this risk. That's my point. So that's it. I think there is a way. People have been making money dealing with these risks and calculating these risks for decades. There are defaults, yes, the risks exist, otherwise the risk would be a fiction. They're not a fiction. But the point is, with good information, I'm giving the Brazilian example, but of course this money will not only be invested in Brazil, they will be invested worldwide. So the challenge is to have very competent bankers and investors to find the right way, the right places to put this money to make it grow safely. I'll give another example. The French development agency, AFD, Agence Française pour le Développement, essentially, well, they invest over $1 billion a year in Brazil. They raise capital with the risk classification of France, which I think is AAA plus, whatever. And they lend this money in Brazil at an interest rate which is much lower than the private market in Brazil, because they raise this fund, as I said, with French risk. And still, although it is a development cooperation agency, the French state doesn't put money there. They get the revenue they need to pay for their costs. And they have been doing that for decades. And as I said, they invest more than $1 billion a year. They lend more than €1 billion euros a year in Brazil, and they can make money with that. So what I'm saying is, yes, I know there is no free lunch. Risk is true, but the point is, with the right information and with clever people working, we can, we believe this spread is feasible. And we also believe, in fact, that yes, risk is overpriced in many places. That's why we believe this is viable. The right people with the right information can obtain a significant spread and therefore make it viable. So this is my response to Max's criticism, which I said I think is very welcome, and we need inconvenient truth when they are true. But I just think in this case there is a way in between, and it's not me. I'm not a finance expert in any way. There are quite clever people who have been studying this for a long time. In fact, this is not a Brazilian idea. This idea has been going on in the World Bank for more than a decade. We just took the idea and did our best to work on it and try to garner political support for this to move forward. And we're optimistic that we will be able to have other institutional investors and make it happen. So I'll stop here for the moment and I'm open to questions.
Max, do you want to weigh in? We don't have any student here who is super eager to talk.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Cabral, for your presentation. So from concept note 3, I got the idea that TFFF mainly wants to invest not in the examples you gave where development banks are engaging in like real economy projects and de-risking those, but rather with a focus on emerging market sovereign bonds, so state debt of emerging markets. Is that not the most updated version of the TFFF concept?
Well, I think this is not totally decided yet. And they will certainly make a portfolio which makes sense business-wise. This is not a charity. They have to make this money grow, and they will do it where it makes sense.
So as far as I understood the proposal, it wants to mainly engage in bond markets. And whereas I like totally agree that if you have like what you would call in finance an alpha, like an information advantage on the general market, then you can make profitable deals. When it comes to the international bond market, though, that is not like a peer-to-peer business, but that's happening on the stock market or in the financial market, the bond market, obviously. And there you have like millions of people buying and selling bonds, and you have prices for every single sovereign bond that is like changing by the second. And if new information comes in, prices adjust. I'm an economist by training, and you would usually in these kinds of like very broad markets would talk about an rather efficient market where there might be some mispricing, but the mispricing, it would be quite remarkable if this mispricing is constant for decades and as easy explainable as all high income countries don't pay enough on their debt maybe, and all emerging economies pay too much on their debt. This might be true, and the concept note speaks about a 3% gap between developed economies and emerging economies. Some part of this 3% might be explainable due to misjudgment by rating agencies, all this kind of stuff. I wouldn't want to go too deep into the details. But for TFFF to follow up on its promises that it will create 2.5 billion up to 4 billion every year, most, if not all, of the current spread would need to be stable and harvestable for the next, well, one of the very graphs you showed claimed that it can project the payouts for 40 years, right? And I've reached out to a lot of people, and no one could explain to me where this free money might be coming from. Yeah, that may be for a first comment. I'm glad to talk about a few other points later on, but also I'm still a PhD student to the class. Happy to engage with all of you. If you got any questions, go ahead.
I just want to ask, is the issue clear? The issue that we are discussing, what the problem is? Quickly, my understanding, the idea is we take $25 billion by rich country governments, mostly, and maybe other donors, and $100 billion that come from investors. The money that the governments are giving, dollars are giving, so that if there's any kind of fall, then they get it first, and the other 100 billion much safe. So that is how you can get away with paying low interest rate on the 100 billion. Now, the problem is that what happens if you invest the money into less secure investments that have a higher yield, but what if some of those default? Then the defaults hit the 25, and the defaults might diminish the 25 portion, and sooner or later that might be gone or much of it might be gone. That's sort of changing. Now, if that doesn't happen, if there's no default, then of course you have an annual gain because you're borrowing the 100 billion at a very safe rate, you pay relatively low interest, and you invested in developing market bonds at a higher interest. So the annual money that the fund is contributing comes out of the difference in those two areas. The rate which you pay to your country of investors, and the rate that you get from investing in developing. That's basically it. What Max is saying is that there is no free lunch. interest rates in developing countries are higher for a reason. They're higher for reasons which is that risk of default. And that risk of default must be absorbed by the 25 billion. And that means that 25 billion if everything goes well, then this 4 billion to the interest rate spread is forthcoming. But if not, then there's a problem. Now, if there's nothing further on this question, maybe we should also discuss the question that you raised, Marco, about is $4 a hectare, is that enough? Is that anybody off the sofa? Is anybody going to really do something? Let's say the Brazilian government might make 1.5 billion of that 4 billion every year. Is 1.5 billion significant in the Brazilian budget so that Brazil can do significant activities that will preserve forest for that money?
Thanks. Yes, that is significant. So far, in fact, the bulk of our expenditures with forest conservation are paid by Brazilian taxpayers. It's important to be clear because so there are those funds, there's the GEF, the GCF. Brazil is the largest recipient of most of these funds, or among the largest. And the Amazon Fund is a significant one, etc. But frankly, this is just icing in the cake. Comes nowhere near what we spend ourselves in fighting deforestation in Brazil. We spend almost $1 billion a year of Brazilian taxpayers' money on environmental expenditures in general, the bulk of it in fighting deforestation and so on. As I said, the Brazilian Amazon is larger than the territory of India. It's more than 4 million square kilometers. It's a huge territory. We're not such a rich country. So this weighs heavily in our national budget. And this money would really make a difference. It would probably be more than double our budget. So if it is used strategically, it can really make a difference, yes. And for you to have an idea of the challenge, so there is about 15 million people living in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, which is not much for a territory which, as I said, is roughly the size of India. It's about India has 1.5 billion, and it's about 100,000 less. The population density is about 100,000 times less than India. So for that territory, it's not a lot of people, but it's still 15 million people. And these people need to make a living. Most of them live in big cities, especially in Manaus and in Belém. So they work in services, industry, and so on. But there are still a few 100,000 people who live on the forest or in agriculture. So these people have to have options. We can't just call the police and jail them all. This is the whole debate about just transition in the climate regime, right? The debate about just transition in climate change started actually as a concern of rich countries. It was about coal miners in East Germany or in the Appalachia in the US. What will these people do with their lives since they can't mine coal any longer? Well, this is not only a white people's problem. This is very much a problem in the third world. There in the Amazon, in the Yanomami indigenous land in the Amazon, in the end of the previous government, there were more than 30,000 gold miners, illegal gold miners, spilling mercury into the rivers and so on. It's a human tragedy. We've had a huge effort with the police, the armed forces, and so on to get these people out of those indigenous lands. And the bulk of it is addressed. But these people will not disappear. And we may jail the bosses of those illegal mining initiatives, but you can't jail 30,000 people. This is a large-scale social problem. we need to find options, viable economic options for these people, and this takes money. So it is an expensive venture to address this issue in Brazil. And yeah, as I said, resources are vital. And in those areas where there could be deforestation, legal deforestation, the only way to stop it is by paying for the ecosystem service of keeping those areas in their natural state. So yes, this money makes a difference. It will probably double the budget that we have in our environmental agencies. And I think we can do interesting things with that, invest a lot in restoration, um, invest in fighting deforestation, in paying for ecosystem services, and so on. And as I said, there will also be a very important revenue going to our indigenous peoples and local communities. So yes, we're not doing this only for Brazilian interest, and I think this is the least important part of it. We see this as a global problem. As the president of COP30, Brazil has to think globally, and we're serious about it. We have been spending our own taxpayers' money for a long time for something which matters more to the world than to ourselves. It does matter a lot to ourselves as well, but I'm saying that this is not just a self-interested initiative. We're thinking globally. But as far as Brazil is concerned, yes, it can make a big difference in Brazil. As I said, because we will allocate this strategically. You can't do anything with $4 per hectare in the agricultural frontier where it is very profitable to plant soybeans or raise cattle. But if you concentrate this money, if you get those $4 per hectare in areas where there is no risk and concentrate it where there is risk, we can make very interesting things with that. Let me come back to Max's comments on sovereign debt and so on. I'll give you an example. Well, there was the Latin American debt crisis in the 80s, mid 80s. Mexico defaulted on its debt, and then Brazil defaulted on its debt, and so on. But since then, there hasn't been, with the exception of Argentina, there hasn't been any other significant Latin American country who defaulted on its debt. Brazil had its last debt default in 1986, so 39 years from now, 39 years ago. So, and interest rates in Brazil nowadays in our government bonds are almost 15%. So there's a spread of over 10% above inflation. That's why banks are so profitable in Brazil. So we do believe there's a lot
Is
of
this in the same
mispricing.
currency, Marco? Is that dollar denominated both times, Brazilian and US?
No, I'm saying in Brazil, but that's the point. Inflation in Brazil is roughly 10%,
Right.
and the central bank is paying 15%. So there's a spread of 10%. It's a money-making machine. That's why banks are so profitable in Brazil. We are perhaps close to the extreme. Very few countries have such a high spread, but others also do. So we do believe there is significant mispricing still going on. And that's where we think it makes sense to invest in government bonds. Just as an illustration, as I said, it was 39 years ago the last time Brazil defaulted on its debt. I can't think of any more profitable investment than Brazilian government bonds.
So I do agree that Brazilian bonds have been a great investment for the last 20 years, but you surely know.
So I wish we spent our money more wisely, but I mean, the service of our debt takes up the bulk of our national budget.
But like a couple of counter arguments, unfortunately. So in 2001, Argentine defaulted on its debt, right? And
yeah, but
Brazil.
I'm saying that Argentina is the exception. Mexico
Okay,
didn't.
but
Brazil, among the largest South Latin American economies, only Argentina defaulted recently. And that was 24 years ago anyway.
Brazil got a bailout by the IMF in 2002 and 3, I think. Then
that's not a
Uruguay.
default.
Sorry?
That's
No,
not
it
a
was not a
default.
default. I agree. But I mean, you are buying bonds, and then the prices of those bonds will fall significantly, and a crisis is enough for the rainforest payments, and maybe even the 25 billion in state capital that ensures the 100 billion of private capital to be eaten up. But Uruguay defaulted as well in 2003. Ecuador defaulted in 2008 and 2020. And then there was the default of Venezuela in 2017. And this is only Latin America. I got a list of these defaults in front of me, by the way. I don't have that much knowledge about it. And that was only Latin America. There was also, but the TFFF does not want to only invest in Brazil or in rainforest economies for that matter, but it wants to invest in a very broad amount of sovereign bonds in emerging economies on a broader scale. And to add to that list, Ukraine was B-rated and then defaulted because of that war, obviously. But who says there won't be another war in the next 40 years? Then Belarus defaulted in 2022. There was Côte d'Ivoire in 2011, Greece in 2012. There's a whole bunch of examples of economies defaulting. And the big emerging market crisis was in the end of the 1990s, with Russia defaulting in 98 and Pakistan in 99. So the claim that emerging market bonds have been an amazing deal in the past is only true if you manage to invest in the right economies. Brazil, absolutely, surely was one of them. But that's not TFF's strategy. And all we are talking about here is only looking in the past. And I mean, I only have to name the current president in the White House. The world economy is under extreme tension right now, although stock markets don't really appreciate this so far. And who knows what happens? One wrong word by Lula and Donald Trump freaks out and starts a trade war against Brazil, right? And that's exactly what I'm saying. There is a huge risk in this. The past isn't enough to project the future. And well, if things go wrong, then 25 billion are gone and the rainforest doesn't really profit from this. And it's surely not a high percentage every year, but a few percentages sneak in every year of a global financial crisis maybe. And then this approach implodes.
Well, I don't think we can take this discussion any further because there is an obvious imbalance. You're an economist and I am not. So I cannot discuss with you technically at the same level. Now we will have to let history speak. The proposal is on the table. We already invested $1 billion in this fund. We expect quite a few announcements to be made in Belém, and history will tell us. That's as much as I can say, I think, on this.
Yeah, let me ask you this, Marco. The reason, I mean, you might say, isn't it much more elegant if we just go to the rich countries and say, give us $4 billion a year to pay out in order to preserve the world's forests? Now,
the answer will be no.
well, I'm asking you, this seems to be politically unrealistic under present conditions, right? We have to go this complicated route in order to get any money at all.
That's it. The GCF raises about $10 billion every 4 years. So roughly $2.5 billion a year, which is then allocates as grants mostly. There are loans as well, but the bulk of it is grants. So, and this is already very difficult to get. So there is no room in the current world to raise any more grant funds. We've seen the Sevilla conference a few months ago about official development assistance. There is no money available for grants. It's completely out of question. I think it will be a big test whether we can put together the TFFF. We're not sure. We're optimistic, but only time will tell. And we have made the first move, and we are investing much of our political capital in making it happen. But I think that's as much as I can say at this point.